We have now been 3 months into this season. I know, time flies when you're having fun, but from the start of May, when Season 2 launched, to now, halfway through August, we have been about 3 months into this new season, and now we have a question to answer. So Blizzard, before the release even of Dragonflight, went on a rampage of changing a lot of affixes in Mythic Plus. We have lost, for example, on the release of Dragonflight, we have lost Inspiring and Necrotic as affixes in our pool of possible affixes, and then for the beginning of Season 2, we lost Quaking, we lost Grievous, and we lost Volcanic. Then Blizzard pulled a 180. Players were not happy that affixes like Explosive were staying in the game, and a relatively harmless affix like Volcanic was leaving, so Blizzard changed their mind before the release of Season 2, and instead we lost Grievous, Quaking, and Explosive. So that was the main change before the beginning of this season. Of course, these affixes were replaced by Entangling, by Afflicted, and by Incorporeal. So now that we have gone through 3 months, now that we have gone through over 2 full rotation of affix combinations in Mythic Plus, what is the judgment? What is the rating we give to these changes in Mythic Plus? What can we say about the season? Well, we can say first that Entangling overall is a decent addition if you put it against, for example, let's just do it the simple way. Would you rather have Entangling in Mythic Plus, or would you rather have Explosive? You know, I would go for a 95-5 split. I would say 95% of the players would rather have Entangling over having to deal with Explosive again. So I would consider it a win. What about Entangling versus Quaking? You know, maybe it's not 95-5, but I would say a 90-10 would still be reasonable. 90% of the players would still rather deal with Entangling over something like Quaking. And then we have the last of the affixes, which is Grievous. So, would you rather have Entangling or Grievous? This might be something like a 50-50, only because the 50 who don't mind Grievous were probably Zug DPS players who cared little for healing and therefore didn't really mind Grievous, but you know, for everyone who actually cared about healing people, they would definitely be more happy about Entangling over something like Grievous being in the game. So we can say that overall the replacement and the addition of Entangling as a Mythic Plus affix has been quite a good and decent addition. Is not too much of a oppressive type of affix. It can still be dealt by more or less every class, as we have pointed out multiple times before. Most classes having some kind of movement ability or dispel on themselves that can remove a slow, so it's not even that big of a deal as an affix. Where we enter a little bit more of a slimy, muddy, and nebulous territory is for the next two, Incorporeal and Afflicted. Let's start with the more manageable one, which is Incorporeal. So the whole deal of Incorporeal is that you have to crowd control them. Now, we have gotten since the start some question marks about certain specs and classes, like for example a Death Knight or a Warrior, which cannot that easily deal with this affix. Previously, before the changes to this affix, the question marks were on even more specs and classes, like for example Monk and Demon Hunter and even Rogue. That's because these mobs were planned to spawn every 20 or so seconds. And these classes like Monk and Demon Hunter, even though they had access to things like Paralysis or things like Imprison, these cooldowns were 45 seconds long. Same goes for Rogues being able to blind the enemies. Those cooldowns were still way too long for the spawn rate of Incorporeal. However, ever since Incorporeal was made to have a near 1 minute spawn rate, all of these classes were made much more handy, much more manageable to deal with this affix. Of course, you still have plenty of other classes in a much better position, like a Paladin can turn evil plus Forbearance, 2 different Incorporeal mobs for a 2-for-1. Warlocks can fear and banish, for example, right? Many other specs have just a single cast, very easy to have, like a freezing trap, like a polymorph, like a hex. So it was manageable for most specs and classes besides the poor warriors and the poor death knights. It might have also some annoying spawn positions, so you might not even realize a mob is out because it spawns behind the corner, or maybe it spawns ahead of you over the turn of the room and you can't even see it. But besides that, most of the classes were able to deal with it. It's annoying, of course, it's frustrating for specs and classes like warrior and DK to not be able to deal with them at all, but if you only have one of these specs and classes in your group, the other 4 players should have been more than able to deal with Incorporeal. If we have the question about whether or not you prefer Incorporeal to something like Grievous or Quaking or Explosive, the numbers might not be 90-10 or 95-5 like we had for Entangling, but we should still be above the 70 cutoff line, right? I would say maybe something like a 70-30 for players preferring Incorporeal over something like Explosive, maybe even an 80-20 for players preferring it over Quaking. Again, the closer one might be over Grievous. Maybe players preferred Grievous over the annoyance of having to crowd control this Incorporeal mob. Where things get quite challenging though is with Afflicted, because if the bad part of Incorporeal is that you have a couple of specs, a couple of classes rather, like DK and Warrior. With Afflicted, it gets a little bit worse, because Afflicted is about dispels. So whether it is a disease dispel, a curse dispel, or a poison dispel, you have to have some kind of dispel in your toolkit to deal with these mobs. Well, this means that not only Death Knight and Warrior are still unable to deal with Afflicted because they have no way to dispel anything, on top of them you also have to add Demon Hunters, who have no ways to dispel. You also have to add Hunters, you also have to add Rogues, and you also have to add Warlocks. So now the range of specs that can't deal with Afflicted becomes a little bit more large, closer to 50% of the classes in the game unable to deal with Afflicted. Now, it's definitely not because of this, but if you look at the meta, you have, for example, Druid, Mage, Evoker, Priest and Paladin all able to dispel, all able to deal with Afflicted. Even specs that were meta or had a strong spec before this Exodia came to be, like for example Shaman with Enhancement, or for example something like a Druid with a Balanced Druid, or something like a Monk if you were playing Windwalker. All these specs also had ways to dispel Afflicted. This is likely the worst of the added affixes. It might also be made worse by the developing of the dungeons from Blizzard, because the more dangerous debuffs and dots that you make the mobs put on players in a dungeon, the harder it is for you to deal with Afflicted, because of course the healer will be busy dispelling the players rather than the afflicted mobs. You have instances like, for example, the more notorious ones, the magic debuffs, the magic dots in Vortex Pinnacle, for example, the poisons or the diseases that happen in places like Brackenhide Hollow is another example. The magic debuff making the tank unhealable, basically, in Freehold. That's also something that's gonna make Afflicted harder. You also have some magic debuffs happening here and there throughout the dungeon in Halls of Infusion. So that is going to make, of course, Afflicted even harder. It becomes somewhat unlucky. You know, imagine a dream scenario completely made up where you have a situation with a tank that's a warrior, and then you have a healer, whatever healer you want, and then you have a DPS warlock, a DPS warrior, and a DPS demon hunter. How are they dealing with Afflicted? You only have one healer across all of the group able to deal with dispelling anything in the group. And what happens when that composition goes into Vortex Pinnacle, for example, or Brackenhide? Now the healer has to choose between one dispel on the player or one dispel on the Afflicted, and if he dispels the player, he has to manually heal both of the Afflicted spawns. That seems like not too bright of a gameplay decision from Blizzard to put several specs and several classes in such a situation where they feel like they are not contributing to a key as much as many other classes are able to. So if we go back to our chances of players preferring this affix over the previous ones that were removed, we can say this one versus explosive, it might even still be 50-50. Some players might really hate explosive to see it back. They would rather still keep and chill with this afflicted affix over explosive. But for Grievous, I think we have our first win for the old removed affixes. I think it would be a 70-30 maybe in favor of Grievous compared to Afflicted. And then we have Quaking. Quaking might also be somewhere in favor, like a 60-40 in favor of Quaking over something like Afflicted. At least Quaking is something that affects everyone. It does not spawn extra mobs, it doesn't require extra weak auras or extra buttons to be pressed. It's mostly just an IQ test to see if players can, number one, stop casting, and number two, not clap each other with Quaking every once in a while. It seems still more manageable than Afflicted, and more importantly, it pits everyone at the same level. It gives everyone a chance to successfully deal with the same affix, as opposed to something like Afflicted, which basically puts AFK 40% of the classes that cannot deal in any way with Afflicted. So at the end of the recap, we can say, I would say somewhat confidently, that Entangling was a good addition and that it is generally a well-liked affix, especially if you have to compare it with the affixes that were removed to let Entangling make it into the rotation. Then we have Incorporeal, which I believe it is still a successful introduction in the game, at least more successful than the ones that were removed a few months ago, but not nearly as good as Entangling. It can still prove to have some issues, it can still clutter your screen, perhaps spawn them in annoying situations and annoying positions, and also be a little bit unfair for a couple of the classes that cannot deal with Incorporeal as easily. But overall, when compared with Quaking or Explosive or Grievous, it still nets out to be a positive compared to the previous set of affixes we had. The last one being Afflicted. We can say that overall it's a loss. It's a net negative compared to what we lost before this season. I would say both Grievous and Quaking would have been a better set of affixes over something like Afflicted. We can leave it as somewhat of a 50-50 between Afflicted and Explosive. I think they would have both been quite annoying to deal with overall. But at the very least, I'm still giving the edge to Explosive. I'm giving the edge to Explosive because still it can be dealt with by everyone in the group. Everyone can help, everyone can contribute, everyone could be at fault or responsible for dealing with it, although we know 95% of the player base believes explosives are exclusively a healer's job, but still, technically they can be dealt with by everyone, as opposed to Afflicted, which has many classes unable to even have a chance to do anything to this affix. So the TLDR, 3 months into this season, is Entangling, very good, Incorporeal, kind of good, Afflicted, bad. Hoping that, much like Blizzard fixed many of the current affixes with several quality of life changes or straight up nerfs to things like Sanguine or Raging or Bolstering or Spiteful before the release of Season 3, we wish to see also some positive quality of life changes to Afflicted, especially in the number of specs and classes able to contribute to help with this affix. So, with this out of the way, let me guys know, of course, what you think about the current season's affixes as well as the previously removed affixes, and how do you think the situation stands in right now when it comes to the affix combinations of Mythic Plus. Besides this, we are now leaving each other on this Tuesday, on the eve of yet another reset in patch 10.1.5. We are starting our goodbyes as usual by thanking all of the Patreon supporters as well as everyone who is contributing completely for free by liking and commenting down below on this video as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I hate it when you think you have the rest of the day ahead of you to chill at home and you just realize you are missing something and you have to go out to get it. God damn it.